Tonight, normally here on Wednesday nights, you know that we are going through the book of 1 Kings, and we are at an amazing point in time in Scripture, looking at the life of Elijah, just about to begin. However, because it is the Passion Week, as I prayed more, I felt like I want to stay in that moment. And so would you open your Bibles with me to John chapter 13 this evening? John chapter 13. Father, speak to us this evening through your word. Lord, open our eyes. We again, as we said, we want to see more of Jesus. Lord, this is your week, and we just want to be in the moment, Lord. Keep it fresh in our minds. What was happening that week? We pray that you would speak to us tonight, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen. The Gospel of John, chapters 13 through 17, will take you through roughly a 36-hour period of time. Now, when you read the Gospels collectively, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you get a better understanding of all of the things that took place. John, unique to the rest of the Gospel writers, is actually writing looking back 30 years later. He's looking back and he's reflecting on what happened. And some of the other Gospel writers fill in the details and give more information. But basically, if you look at the Passion Week, it began on Sunday. It began with the triumphal entry of Jesus Christ into Jerusalem, riding on a donkey, fulfilling biblical prophecy spoken by Zechariah in chapter 9. 500 years earlier, the people waving palm branches, as we said on Sunday, shouting Hosanna, Psalm 22, the messianic psalm, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And Jesus receiving that adoration and not stopping anyone. The Pharisees told Jesus, hey, listen, tell those people to be quiet. Jesus said, if I tell them to be quiet, the rocks themselves would cry out. And Jesus received this praise and recognition from the people. But then you come to Monday, and on Monday, Jesus goes back into Jerusalem and he comes to the temple area, and for a second time in his ministry, he begins to cleanse the temple. He cleansed it at the beginning of his ministry, and now 3 years later, he cleanses the temple once again. And the reason is the temple had been reduced to a den of thieves when it was supposed to be a house of prayer. Jesus began to overturn the tables of the money changers, drive them out. Anything that was hindering the work of the ministry was removed, and when it was removed, order was restored, and people who needed a touch and healing from Jesus, they were able to come in freely and be ministered to. But then you move to Tuesday. And very early in the morning, Jesus returned to the temple once again. This was to be his final day of ministry, scholars believe. And this was a time when he was teaching. It was a day of rejection. It was a day of controversy. It was when Jesus was confronted by the religious leaders consisting of the scribes, the lawyers, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Herodians. And they began to examine and cross-examine Jesus in several controversial areas, asking questions for the sole purpose of making him look bad in the eyes of the people or getting him to incriminate himself that they might turn him over to Rome. And so they asked him about civil authority. Was it right to pay taxes unto Caesar? And Jesus responded. Then they asked him about his theology concerning the resurrection and the reality of it. The Sadducees presented a worn out argument that Jesus quickly silenced. Also, they questioned him on authority. Where did you get the authority to come in and overturn these tables? To which he also responded. And finally, he was questioned about what was the greatest commandment. And he said it was to love God with everything that's within you and to love your neighbor as yourself. Also during this day, Jesus spoke the Olivet Discourse, which is, and we'll get there in Matthew chapter 24 and 25, it is the most detailed passage of Scripture concerning future events next to the book of Revelation. Jesus also pronounced a series of woes, which we looked at on Sunday in Matthew chapter 23 against the religious leaders. He also spoke several parables. But then you come to Wednesday, and the record of the ministry of Jesus on Wednesday seems to go somewhat silent. There's not many things happening on Wednesday. Perhaps he was praying, rest, and preparing for what lie ahead. But then you come to Thursday. where Jesus told his disciples to go into the city and find a man carrying a pitcher of water, and he would direct them to a furnished upper room where they were to make ready for the Passover meal together. And John doesn't say much about the details concerning it, but he just brings us right into the room and what happened that night, which made an impact in his life. Leonardo da Vinci painted that well-known and recognizable painting of the Last Supper. Have you seen it? Perhaps you own a copy of it in your house. It's not accurate. They're all sitting at a table, it's one long table, and Jesus is the one with the halo over his head in the middle, obviously. But that's not an accurate picture of what happened in that upper room at that meal, because what would happen in that culture is they would actually recline on pillows. There was like a U-shaped kind of a table, and everyone, pardon me, would lean on one elbow. They would have their feet behind them, and they would be eating, and I'm practically doing it, reaching over and eating that way. That was just what they did. That was the actual upper room. And there are a number of things that took place that night that I want us to consider. This final meal that Jesus had with his disciples. And I want us first to consider, think about what Jesus knew that night. Look at verse 1. Now, before the feast of Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come, that he should depart from this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And supper being ended, the devil already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. Verse 3, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hand and that he had come from God and was going to God. John tells us that Jesus, on this night, knew several things in advance. For one thing, it says he knew that his hour had now come. Throughout the ministry of Jesus, you will find him referencing an hour. At the very beginning of John's gospel, there in the city of Cana, when they ran out of wine, and Jesus' mother, who kind of was part of the wedding procedure and part of helping with the reception, said they've run out of wine. And Jesus said, "Woman, what has your concern to do with me? Mine hour has not yet come." Later on, his brothers, not believing in him, would begin to give him a difficult time about being the Messiah. And they would say, "Well, if you're really the Messiah, why don't you go up to Jerusalem and show yourself to everybody?" He said, "Listen, my hour has not yet come." But here we find out that he knew he was right on the edge of the hour. What hour was he talking about? We'll see him go into the Garden of Gethsemane on Friday, and what will he say? My hour has come. It's the hour that he'd been living for, this one moment in time when he would die for the sins of humanity. This 1 hour, it had finally come, and he knew what awaited him. He knew that he was going to depart. The time had come. But Jesus also knew in advance that Judas would betray him, that Judas would betray him for 30 pieces of silver. Jesus also knew that his disciples would desert him. He knew that when the soldiers came to take him away, that all of his disciples would run for their lives. He also knew that Peter, although claiming to be courageous and ready to die with Jesus, would deny that he knew him 3 times before the rooster crowed. And Jesus, knowing all of these things, was not surprised when they took place. And even though Jesus discern this all in advance, please look at verse 1 and see what it says. He loved those who were in the world, and he loved them till the end. And that word there literally means he loved them to the uttermost. He loved them until completion. That is the completion of their redemption. He loved them to the point that he was going to die for them. Listen, tonight, folks, if anything that Passion Week speaks of, emphatically, undeniably, is this: God loves you. You cannot go through this week without understanding the love of God. This is what motivated Christ to come, because of God's great love for you. Greater love has no man than this, that he laid down his life for his friends. Do you understand that this week? Do you understand it tonight? How much God really does love you. That might come as a surprise to some of you. Others of you think, well, of course, I'm so lovable. No, listen, he really does love us. He knows everything about us. All of our inconsistencies, all of our shortfalls, all of our failures. And he says, you know what, I love you, period. That settles it. He loves you. Do you know that? When you know and comprehend the love of Christ, it changes everything in your life. How could somebody love me that much? It goes beyond our ability to comprehend the height, the depth, the length, the breadth of God's love. And yet he loves us. Jesus knew all of these things would take place, but also consider what Jesus did. Look at verse 4. He rose from supper. He laid aside his garments. He took a towel, girded himself. After that, he poured water into a basin and he began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. At some point here at the Last Supper, Jesus gets up from the table, as it says, and he laid aside his outer garments and he wrapped around himself a towel and then began to move throughout the room and wash the dirty, filthy feet of his disciples. Now, normally, imagine many of these roads were not paved that they would travel on. Open sandals. I mean, just filthy feet. And typically when you came into a home for a meal like this, the lowest servant in that house would wash your feet when you came in. No one had washed their feet. Their feet were behind them. Jesus begins to wash their feet, taking this position of the lowest servant. I imagine that the disciples were both shocked and embarrassed to have Jesus, who was their master, washing their feet. It reminds me, it just seems so, God washing my feet. They were humbled. And why do you suppose they were humbled? I'll tell you, because Luke's gospel tells us that right before this meal, right before their feet were washed, guess what? They were having a discussion. Oh, they had this discussion lots of times. Guess what it was about? Who's the greatest? Imagine that. Debating at the Last Supper. Hey, by the way, who is the greatest? And just going back and forth at the dinner table about which one of them is the greatest. And then the greatest in the kingdom starts to wash their feet. How humbling that must have been. Right in front of them. Jesus would have washed John's feet. Now, John refers to himself in his gospel as the disciple whom Jesus loved. John was one of the inner three disciples, went up onto the Mount of Transfiguration, went into Jairus' home. I mean, there were just certain things that John got to see that maybe some of the other disciples did not. In fact, when Jesus was dying on the cross, he said, John, take care of my mother. I mean, they had a close relationship. So he washed John's feet. Well, that makes sense. He also washed Matthew's feet. Matthew was a tax collector, one of the most hated people, probably in all of Israel, for the work that he did. And yet when Jesus called him, he left everything and followed Jesus. He even wrote a gospel entitled The Gospel of Matthew about the life of Jesus, presenting him as a king. And so Jesus washed Matthew's feet. Oh, he washed Andrew's feet. Every time you read about Andrew in the scriptures, he is always bringing people to Jesus. Every time. Can you imagine that? That's every time your name is mentioned, you're mentioned bringing people to Jesus. That's a good thing to be known for. He washed Andrew's feet. But he also washed Judas's feet. You think about that for a moment. Washing Judas's feet. Man, just all you got to do is just, you're God, just heat that water up to boiling temperature. Guy will never walk again. Break an ankle. I mean, just say it. You know where he's going. You know all of this, and yet you're washing his feet of the one that's going to betray you. Today in the church, we don't have foot washing ceremonies. And part of the reason for that is because although Jesus did this in the upper room, you don't find them doing it in the book of Acts. You don't find Paul talking about it in the epistles. So we don't really have foot washing as one of the ordinances of the church. But we do have communion because Jesus talked about it. It's talked about in the book of Acts. They also carried it out in the epistles. We do have baptism. Jesus talked about it, baptized. They baptized in the book of Acts. They talk about it in the epistles. Paul speaks of this in Romans chapter 6. But when it comes to foot washing, we really don't have that today. I remember on one occasion traveling to Honduras, into a poor area of Honduras with a team of people to do some ministry. And obviously we send out teams from here all the time. And on that trip, all of us are ready to go. Yay, Jesus, let's get it. Let's do this. We just want to go serve people. And I mean, from the moment we got on that plane, there was a test. He said, what's the test? They lost all of our luggage. All of it for a couple days. First day, God, you're so good. We're going to trust you. Next day, people are like, it's like, remember when Moses was like, Lord, they're about to stone me. I've kind of felt like that a little bit, that people were turning. And it was so hot. And the ACs were like breathing barely, like, people were getting angry. I mean, people that just brought everything out of us. And I sat down with the team. And everybody was sweating and mad and angry and just, I don't know what to do. Like they're gonna hurt me, And the Lord spoke to my heart. And by the way, he hasn't said this since, but on that day, the Lord, as I was teaching, the Lord said, I want you to wash all these people's feet. I was like, I don't know about that. Here's what I'll do, Lord, I'll hose them down. I'm out from a distance. Stand over there. I'll get you. We're good. I'm not getting in there. That is, wow. Got issues. No. But the Lord spoke to my heart and said, do it. Everybody was angry. Everybody was sweaty. Everybody was upset. And I just thought, I heard the Holy Spirit say, wash their feet. I was like, so me and my assistant pastor, I said, hey, bro, just real quick, can you go ask the lady for like a bucket and some water and some towels? He just went and got it. I said, we're going to wash these people's feet. All right. And man, the Lord just showed up. It was just something, and it was, suddenly we were all humbled. We were all broken. We were all just like, Jesus, forgive us. We are whiners. We are complainers. We are not tough. We are babies, we're sorry. And just change the whole atmosphere that day. And then our luggage came. So praise God. Everybody was rejoicing then. But then Jesus came to Peter, verse 6. And he came to Simon Peter, and Peter said to him, Lord, are you washing my feet? Jesus answered and said to him, what I am doing, you do not understand now, but you will know after this. Peter said to him, you shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered him, if I don't wash you, you have no part with me. Simon said to him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. Don't you just love Peter? He's Lord, you're never going to wash my feet. And I think he just thought, it's not right. There's no way you're going to wash my feet. You're the Son of God. We know this. You remember you asked me in Caesarea Philippi, I said you were no, I am not letting you. It's kind of like when Jesus came to be baptized by John the Baptist, you remember? And John was like, you know what, actually, I think you should probably baptize me. It just didn't seem right. I understand why Peter thought this. He said, you're never going to do it, Lord. And then Jesus said, well, if I don't do it, you have no part with me. And then Peter's like, well, then just let's go. I want all of you, just shower me, whatever. Lord's like, that's not necessary, Peter. Just give me your foot. Let me do this thing. So Jesus said to him, he who is bathed needs only to wash his feet, but it's completely clean. And you are clean, but not all of you. For he knew, here it is again, who would betray him. Therefore he said, you are not all clean. You think it would be obvious what Jesus was doing, but Peter was resistant. But Jesus said these words to Peter, and they have ministered to me in different ways in different seasons of my life, where Jesus said to Peter, Peter, what I'm doing now you don't get it. You don't understand. But you will know after this. And of course, in the context, he's speaking about, I'm about to explain what I'm doing. Just sit tight. But as I look a little bit deeper, I think, how many times have you been in a situation in your life as a Christian where you know the Lord desires to do a work in your life? You're confident of that because the scriptures say that, but you don't exactly know what it is he's doing. You have a lot of questions. The Lord would say to us in those moments, hey, listen, what I'm doing right now, you don't get it, but you'll know after this. Have you ever not known what God was doing and then you got to the other side of it and it like, there it is. I can see. I can see why that door closed, because if it had opened, this would have happened. And I can see why that door opened, because if it hadn't, I wouldn't have been. God just shows you over time as you trust him. We don't always understand what he's doing. And the fact is, it's possible that you might be there tonight. Lord, I do not understand what is happening with this. You might not right now. But you just keep trusting in God. You just keep walking this out. You just keep believing him. You keep reading his word. You persevere. You hold fast to what he said. And it will make sense later on. I'll say this. Some things aren't going to make sense until we're there. I got some questions for God. And I know one day they're going to be answered. They might not be answered here, but they're definitely going to be answered there. But I keep trusting him, and you must too. Is there something the Lord has allowed to come into your life tonight they're having a hard time with? And you don't understand the reason for it? Well, you might not know now, but the Lord has ways of revealing it. And so Peter, uncertain of what God was doing, but then Jesus, after he had washed their feet, you'll notice that he begins to help them understand exactly what it was that he was doing. And Jesus said in verse 12, when he had washed their feet, taken his garments, and sat down again, he said, do you know what I have done to you? I want to point something out to you that the Lord ministered to me today, and I have it highlighted in my Bible. But if you look at verse 1, notice the words, Jesus knew. And then if you go to verse 3, it says, Jesus knowing. And then as you make your way down to verse 7, you will know after this. And then verse 11, for he knew. And then verse 12, do you know? Do you know? Do you know what I'm doing? Do you understand this? And it's the reason why I cite that is because the word that Jesus uses for know in verse 12 is different than all of the other times that it's used in this chapter. It's a different word. It's the word, do you know? Absolutely. Do you understand what has just happened? It's more than just the washing of your feet. This experience is more than just me getting a basin of water. That's part of it, and cleansing your feet because they were dirty. But there's more to this lesson than you see at this moment. Folks, think about it. Jesus is giving them a picture, an illustration of what's about to take place. He takes the place of a servant, humbles himself. But in so doing, he lays aside, sets something aside, puts on the garments of a servant, does the work in cleansing them from their filth and their dirt, picks his garment back up. When Jesus came, the Apostle Paul tells us in the book of Philippians chapter 2, he said, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant, and coming in the likeness of men, and being found in the appearance of a man, he humbled himself and he became obedient to the point of death, even a death on the cross. When Paul penned those words to the Philippians stating Jesus made himself of no reputation, it means literally he emptied himself of his divine privileges. He, Jesus, coming to the earth, he set aside the garment, if you would, of divine privilege, and coming to this earth, clothed himself like a servant in order that we could be cleansed. And when the work was done, and when the cleansing had taken place, and when he had died and rose again, guess what? The divine garments were placed back on him once again. He is seated on the throne even now. It's a picture of what he was doing. And so he says to his disciples in verse 12, when he had washed their feet, do you know what I am doing, what I've done to you? Verse 13, you call me teacher and Lord, you say well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. Do you really understand this? Jesus is saying. Do you recognize what I've done? I've given you an example, an illustration. I have served you. This is the King of glory. I did not come to be served, but to serve, to give my life a ransom for many. He serves his disciples, and then he says, listen, this is the model. This is the example to follow. As I have done to you, so you also ought to do to one another. Serving one another. Washing other people's feet, in a sense. Not so much in a literal sense, necessarily, unless God tells you to, but certainly in a figurative sense. When you serve other people in the name of the Lord, you are following the example of Jesus. He was the servant of all. It may not be the most glamorous opportunity, but it brings the greatest blessing if you're following the example of Jesus. And then Jesus said, I've given you this example. If you're looking for an example to follow, if you're looking for a life of joy, a life of blessing, where is it found? It's found in following his example. Serving other people, putting other people before yourself. Oh, that's not the natural tendency, but it's the example of Jesus. Jesus said in verse 16, most assuredly I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who is sent greater than he who sent him. Verse 17, this is key right here. If you know these things, remember he said, do you know what I'm doing? Now he says, if you know, do you know? If you do, then blessed are you if you do them. You're blessed, Jesus said. You want a blessed life? Then it's less of us and more of him. Serving other people, dying to ourselves in order that the life of Christ may be seen. Our natural tendency is to be served. But when you look at the Passion Week and you look at the life of Jesus, it was all about serving others. Laying aside what I want for what God wants. What does God want? What does he desire? And there's all kinds of opportunities to serve the Lord. We used to say, you'll know you're a servant by the way you act when you're treated like one. Jesus, the ultimate example. And then in verse 18, Jesus makes a startling announcement to everybody. He says, I do not speak concerning all of you. I know whom I have chosen, but that the scripture may be fulfilled, he who eats bread with me has lifted up his heel against me. And I tell you, before it comes, that when it does come to pass, you may believe that I am he. Most assuredly, I say to you, he who receives whoever I send receives me, and he who receives me receives him who sent me. At the Last Supper, as it's coming to a close now, before they would partake of the elements of communion, Jesus makes this unpleasant announcement that nobody expected, and that was this: one of them would betray Jesus. And he tells them, I'm telling you this in advance so you won't be shocked when it happens, but you actually believe I told you before. And here's the interesting thing. No one in that room on that night suspected Judas. Nobody did. Everybody said to themselves, the other gospels recorded, is it me? Is it me? Is it me? Is it me? They all thought, am I the one? No one thought it was Judas. Why? For one thing, Judas had one of the most trusted positions among the disciples in that he used to hold the money box. John tells us, looking back later on, that he used to get his hand in it and use it for himself. The guy was full of greed. John's gospel tells us not only that he would take from the money bag, but he's fake. He had everybody in that upper room fooled. No one knew, except one person. Jesus knew. He knew exactly what was going on. He could see right through the facade. Judas, I've always marveled at Judas. You know, you saw the miracles. You saw all of this. You were part of it. You were right there walking, talking, living with Jesus, and yet you were not really with Jesus. You were fake and good at it. Nobody thought it was Judas. Even after Jesus will send him out, they still don't know. When Jesus said these things, notice this now. But by the way, have you ever been betrayed? Jesus knows what that feels like. Somebody closer to you than anybody you could possibly, he was betrayed. He felt that. He knows what that's like. When Jesus had said these things, verse 21, he was troubled. Notice Jesus now, troubled in spirit, and testified and said, most assuredly I say to you, one of you will betray me. And the disciples looked at one another and they were perplexed about whom he spoke. Now, there was leaning on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples whom Jesus loved. That would be John. John saying there was one. That was me. The disciple Jesus loved. I was leaning back on Jesus. And Simon Peter therefore motioned to him to ask him who it was of whom he spoke. I wonder if Peter thought, which guy is it? Like, tell me. I want to know which guy, who is it, you know? Peter always wanting to defend the Lord. Who is it? And then leaning back on Jesus, he said to him, Lord, who is it? And Jesus said, it is he to whom I shall give a piece of bread when I have dipped it. And having dipped the bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. Now, after the piece of bread, this is scary, Satan entered him. And Jesus said to him, what you do quickly. But no one at the table knew for what reason he had said this to him. Some thought because Judas had the money box that Jesus said to him, buy those things we need for the feast, or that he should give something to the poor. Nobody knew. Folks, listen, Jesus, it says here, was troubled in the spirit. The same one who said, let not your heart be troubled, was troubled. Although Jesus was in control of the entire situation, John wants us to see the humanity of Jesus in that he was troubled. It means inwardly moved. He was moved by the fact that someone who could be so close to him, in his humanity, he felt the betrayal. He felt the pain of that. And yet none of his disciples knew that. Consider this also. Because Jesus was able at the dinner table to speak with Judas privately, it is widely believed that Judas sat, or I should say reclined, to the left of Jesus. John leaning back upon him, Jesus, the host of the Passover, to his left would have been Judas. And think of this, to the left of the one who led the Passover was the seat or the place of honor. He washed his feet. He put him in a place of honor. And even when Judas would come into the Garden of Gethsemane to betray him with kisses, Jesus would say to him, friend, why have you come? There's a lot about the character and nature of Jesus that I have not achieved or fully understand. Having received that piece of bread, Judas then went out, and immediately it was night. And Jesus now speaks to his disciples, the true disciples. And in verse 31, he says some powerful words. He says in verse 31, so when he had gone out, Jesus said, now the Son of Man is glorified. And God is glorified in him. And if God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and glorify him immediately. As I read that again today, I thought to myself, do you find it strange to think that Jesus could be glorified in such suffering? Like the most painful experience you could ever imagine. And yet he says what's about to happen, and he knows what's happening, and he's being betrayed in the moment, and he's about to tell them that they're all going to leave him, and he knows what's coming, that he's going to be separated from the Father. And he said, you know what? God is going to be glorified in this. He's going to be glorified in this. Can you look at the situation that you find difficult and painful tonight, and can you say, in light of the example of Christ and what he endured and what he accomplished, can we say, Lord, be glorified in this? Be glorified in this, God. Show your glory in the midst of this. It seems so unthinkable. How could that be? How could God be glorified? Because the world would have the opportunity to be saved. Jesus said to his disciples in verse 33, little children, I shall be with you a little while longer, and you will seek me. And as I said to you, and I said to the Jews, where I'm going, you cannot come. So now I say to you, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. Jesus is saying his last words to these men before he's about to be betrayed. And he'll say much more, but John highlights this. This is what stuck out to John. In fact, John is called the apostle of love. And you read through 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, and the Gospel of John, you will find the emphasis of love. There was one characteristic that stood out to John, calls himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. I mean, this aspect of the nature of Jesus, this love. And Jesus said, I'm giving you a commandment. And it's not really a new commandment because it's a commandment that you can find. But Jesus said, this is the commandment I'm giving to you. And here's the difference. Oftentimes we say, well, the commandment is love God with all your heart. Yes, all your soul, all your mind, all your strength. The second commandment is like unto it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But Jesus takes it a step further for his disciples. And what does he say? He says, I want you to love one another as I have loved you. What does that look like? I want you to serve one another the way I've served you. And also, I want you to love one another as I have loved. How? Just pause for a second. Ask yourself the question, how has God loved you? I mean, really. In what ways has God demonstrated his love to you? In his provision, his faithfulness, and his care for you? I want you to love like I've loved you. Has he forgiven you? Has he restored you? I mean, think about it. And Jesus said, when we are loving like that, here's what happens. Here's what happens. The world, people outside of the family of faith, what happens? You know what happens? They know that we belong to him because of the love we have for one another. That's how people see. It's not so much like how much intellectual knowledge do I have of the Bible, which by the way is a good thing. You want to grow in your understanding of the scriptures, but how much love do you have for people? Does that show? That is the difference. You ever run into somebody who is just, you realize there's something unique about this person. I don't know what it is. They just seem kind. What is that? They're just naturally kind, perhaps. But if they're a Christian, you know it's a work of the Holy Spirit. I'm not naturally that way. Jesus has changed me. I'm a different person. So before I was unloving, now I'm loving. Because I've experienced his love and I realize this is a commandment for me to love other people the same way he's loved me. And that is how people know that we are Christians, guys. That's how they know. Do we love one another? This isn't a suggestion, this is a commandment. Finally, Jesus says, after he gives this commandment, Simon Peter now still doesn't understand. And he says to him, Lord, where are you going? Where are you going? Jesus answered, where I'm going, you cannot follow me now, but you shall follow me afterward. Remember earlier he said, Peter, what I'm doing now, you don't understand, but you'll know after this. Now he says, you cannot follow me now, but you'll be able to follow me later. Peter said, Lord, why? Oh, Lord, why can't I follow you now? Like, remember your kids say, why? You just say, because I said so. Why can't I follow you now? And then Peter says, you know what? I'll lay my life down for your sake. Where are you going? I'm going. I'm dying with you. What do you mean? I'm ready. Jesus said to him, will you lay down your life for my sake? Most assuredly, I say to you, the rooster shall not crow till you have denied me 3 times. That must have been so devastating for Peter to hear. Just unthinkable. There's no way. In fact, in the other Gospels, he says, even if all of these, referring to the disciples, the others, even if all of these deny you, famous last words, I will never deny you. Jesus said, Peter, actually, you're going to deny me 3 times before the rooster crows. You talk about a difficult dinner. I mean, it started off well. It's the Passover. But what they didn't realize is that this Passover, where they partook of lamb and they partook of all of these herbs and things that symbolized the first exodus of the nation of Israel out of the bondage and slavery of Egypt. That's what the Passover was for. It was a reminder to them. As the angel of death was coming through Egypt, the only way that the nation of Israel was able to escape death was to take a lamb, to kill it, to take the blood of that lamb and to put it on the door and on the side. And the Lord said, when I see the blood, that is the blood of the lamb, I will pass over you. And here is Jesus now, the Lamb of God, who had come to take away the sins of the world. His blood would be shed on the cross, and that blood applied. Death passes over. They didn't understand yet, but they would know after this. And their sorrow, Jesus said, it would be turned to joy. Maybe tonight, in this Passion Week, there are just some things that you don't understand. You don't get it. You have questions for God. We all do from time to time. You're not sure what this means or where he's leading or what he's doing. It happens. And maybe you're wondering, how can you be glorified in this? I'm not really seeing it. Well, friends, listen, we don't always see it. You have to walk by faith and not by sight. Here's what I see. I see Jesus. I see the word. I see his promises. And though I don't see it, I see it. And this helps me, gives me the perspective on what's really going on as I filter all of these things through God's word. And what do I learn? He's loved me to the end. And if he brought you this far, it's not like he's done now. Like, oh, have a great Easter. It's not like he's still here. He's still working. And though you don't understand now, he'll know after this. So trust him. Take him at his word.